The report reached High Marshal Threxa Vaughn's desk at the worst possible hour. In the gap between the Dominion Council's evening session and the private briefing she had been dreading for 3 days. And she read it twice before she allowed herself to believe the numbers were not a transmission error. 9 fleets reporting, 9 confirmations of engagement, 9 tallies of rebel vessels destroyed or captured, 9 formal declarations that the last organized resistance in the Corvi Reach had been extinguished in accordance with Council Directive 4471. 10 fleets had been dispatched, 11 days earlier, in the largest coordinated punitive deployment the Asheville Dominion had authorized in over a century, sent to end permanently and without further negotiation. A rebellion that had cost the Dominion 3 border systems, and in the Council's own carefully chosen language, an intolerable amount of patience. Fleet 10 had not reported. Not destroyed, not delayed, not requesting resupply or reinforcement. Simply silent in a way that 11 days of increasingly frantic relay attempts had failed to explain, its last confirmed position a quiet, unremarkable system on the furthest edge of Corvi space that Dominion cartographers had labeled, with characteristic lack of imagination, Sector 9 Delta. Vaughan set the report down on her desk and looked out the tall viewport of her office aboard Dominion Fleet Command, at the slow, patient turn of the capital world below, and felt the particular, cold weight settle over her that came only when a career built on discipline and precision collided with a mystery that offered neither. 10 fleets, she thought, 230 warships, crewed by nearly 40,000 Dominion personnel, simply gone quiet in a sector of space that held nothing more dangerous, by every intelligence assessment the Dominion possessed, than a starving remnant of rebels too exhausted to keep fighting and a handful of unaffiliated human traders who had never once, in 3 years of monitoring, shown the slightest interest in Dominion military affairs. She was still staring at the report when the door chimed, and Counselor Braxis Threll entered without waiting for permission, which told her everything she needed to know about how the evening briefing was going to go before he'd said a single word. "Oh, you've seen the numbers," he said. "It was not a question." "I have," Vaughan said, "and I don't have an explanation for them yet, which I suspect is not the answer you're hoping to hear before you walk into that chamber." Braxis Threll was a broad, heavily built Asheville of the old military caste, a council seat he had inherited through 3 generations of officers who had built the Dominion's reputation on the simple, unbending principle that overwhelming force, applied decisively and without hesitation, was the only language rebellion had ever truly understood. He did not sit. He rarely did, in her experience, preferring to stand in a way that made every conversation feel faintly like an inspection. "There is only one explanation that fits an entire fleet going silent without a single distress signal, Marshal," he said. "The rebels found something. A weapon, a defense system, something capable of neutralizing 230 warships cleanly enough that not one of them managed to transmit a warning before it happened. I intend to recommend, in the strongest possible terms, that the Council authorize immediate retaliatory bombardment of every system in the Corvi Reach still showing rebel activity. We do not have the luxury of waiting for a second fleet to vanish while we debate the manners of an investigation. 230 warships destroyed cleanly enough to prevent even one distress call," Vaughan said slowly, "would be the single greatest tactical achievement in the last 3 centuries of galactic warfare, accomplished by a rebellion we assessed, 11 days ago, as having fewer than 40 operational vessels remaining and no capital ships of any kind. Forgive me, Counselor, but that explanation asks me to believe in a miracle before it asks me to believe in an investigation." "Then what would you have me tell the Council instead?" Threll's voice hardened. "That we simply don't know. That the largest punitive fleet this Dominion has assembled in a century may have been annihilated by an enemy we cannot identify, and our recommendation is patience." "I would have you tell them the truth," Vaughan said, rising from her desk to meet him at his own eye level, a habit she had cultivated across 20 years of service specifically for conversations like this one. which is that we do not yet know what happened to Fleet 10, and that authorizing the annihilation of an entire rebel population based on a theory we cannot support with a single piece of evidence would not be justice, Counselor. It would be panic wearing the Dominion's uniform. She held his gaze unblinking. Thaug. She felt the risk in doing so settle into her chest like a held breath. Give me a ship and 48 hours. I will go to Sector 9 Delta myself, and I will bring the Council an answer built on evidence rather than fear. If what I find justifies your recommendation, I will make it myself in front of the full chamber and stake my rank on it. But I will not stand by while this Council orders the deaths of civilians, based on a theory that exists only because the alternative is admitting we do not yet understand what happened. Threll studied her for a long moment, and something behind his heavy, deliberate features shifted, not agreement exactly, but the particular reluctant respect one career officer occasionally extended another, even across the widening gulf of disagreement. 48 hours, he said finally. I will hold the vote that long, Marshal, because I have watched you be right about difficult things more often than I have watched you be wrong. But understand what I am risking by doing so. If you are gone longer, or if you return with nothing more than more questions, I will not be able to hold this chamber back a second time. Vaun nodded once, sharp and final, and was already moving toward the door before he'd finished speaking. Then I intend to be back in 47. The scout cruiser Vaun requisitioned for the journey was fast rather than powerful, built for exactly this kind of solitary reconnaissance, and she spent most of the 18-hour transit to Sector 9 Delta reviewing everything the Dominion's intelligence archives held on the Corvi Reach, and the rebellion that had, by every conventional measure, already been dying a slow, inevitable death before the Council ordered 10 fleets to finish it. The Corvi were not, by Dominion standards, a formidable people. A single-system species, technologically capable but never expansionist, they had been absorbed into the Dominion 4 generations earlier through the same pattern of overwhelming demonstration and negotiated surrender that had built the Ashvale's reputation across a dozen conquered worlds. For 3 generations, the arrangement had held uneasy but stable, until a series of resource requisitions during a Dominion border conflict had stripped Corvi agricultural worlds bare in the name of wartime necessity, and the ensuing famine had done what 3 generations of Dominion garrison forces had never managed. It had made rebellion feel, to an exhausted and starving population, like the only remaining choice worth making. Vaun had read the casualty projections from the initial uprising with the particular professional detachment her career had trained into her, and had privately found herself agreeing with very little of the Council's subsequent handling of it. 3 years of escalating punitive raids, each one justified as proportionate response to the last act of rebel sabotage, had produced exactly the outcome any competent strategist could have predicted: a rebellion that should have collapsed within months, instead hardening into something the Corvi were willing to die for, because the alternative, by that point, no longer looked meaningfully different from death anyway. What the intelligence archives had less to say about was the handful of unaffiliated human vessels that had been quietly operating in the Corvi Reach for the better part of 2 years, flagged in routine border monitoring reports as low-priority trade and survey activity, never once suspected of any involvement in the rebellion itself. Vaun pulled up the relevant file now, scanning through sparse notes compiled by Border Patrol officers who had clearly never considered the humans worth more than a cursory mention. A single vessel, registered to something called United Earth Space Command, appeared in the logs more consistently than any other. The Halworth's Promise, captained by a human designated only as R. Calloway, whose ship had been recorded delivering medical supplies and agricultural equipment to Corvi settlements on at least 6 separate occasions over the preceding 18 months, always well within the letter of Dominion trade law, always careful in every recorded interaction, to avoid anything that might be construed as material support for rebellion. It was, Vaun thought, studying the thin file with growing unease, Either a remarkably naive humanitarian gesture from a species barely 3 years into formal conquered contact, or a remarkably patient one. Sector 9 Delta resolved on her scout cruiser's long-range sensors 6 hours later, and what she found waiting there made her sit back from the display console entirely. Her carefully rehearsed expectations of wreckage and radiation scarring giving way to something far stranger. The Fleet 10 was intact. All 230 vessels sat in a wide, orderly holding pattern around the Corvai Reach's primary inhabited world, engines idling, weapons powered down, arranged. Not in any battle formation Vaun recognized, but in something closer to a ceremonial anchorage. No wreckage, no debris field, no sign of the catastrophic engagement Counselor Threll had spent 3 days building his case around. Just 230 Dominion warships sitting quietly in orbit, exactly where they had been sent to end a rebellion, doing nothing at all. And drifting near the fleet's flagship, small and utterly unthreatening against the massed weight of Dominion military hardware around it, a single human vessel, its running lights steady and unhurried, as though it had simply been waiting patiently for someone to finally come and ask what had happened here. Fleet Admiral Dask received her aboard the flagship Asheville's reckoning with the weary, unhurried calm of a man who had clearly spent the last 11 days rehearsing exactly how this conversation would go, and had decided somewhere in that rehearsal that honesty was going to be easier than any alternative he could construct. Marshal Vaun, he said, meeting her at the docking bay himself rather than sending a junior officer, which told her, before either of them had said anything of substance, exactly how seriously he understood the position he was in. I imagine you have a great many questions, and I intend to answer every one of them. I would ask only that you let me explain in the order I lived it, rather than the order the Council will eventually want it summarized. You have my attention, Admiral, Vaun said. You also, I should tell you plainly, have a council chamber back home currently debating whether to order the bombardment of every Corvai settlement still showing signs of life, based on the theory that your fleet was destroyed by some undiscovered rebel superweapon. I have 47 hours to bring them something more useful than a theory. Something crossed Dask's weathered face, not surprise, she thought, but a grim confirmation of exactly the fear that had kept him from breaking radio silence in the first place. Then let me be direct, Marshal, and trust you to understand the difference between insubordination and judgment. Fleet 10 did not fail to destroy the rebellion in this system because we were defeated. We failed to destroy it because I chose not to. And I have spent 11 days trying to determine whether there was any way to report that decision honestly without it being read back home as either cowardice or mutiny. He led her through the flagship's quiet, orderly corridors. Nothing about the crew's bearing suggested a vessel that had suffered any catastrophic engagement, only the particular subdued watchfulness of people waiting to learn whether their commanding officer's decision was about to end all of their careers, and into a briefing room where a small holographic display waited, already prepared. As though Dask had known this exact conversation was coming, and had built his defense with the same care he'd once have applied to a battle plan. We arrived in this system 9 days ago, he said, activating the display, which showed a tactical reconstruction of Fleet 10's approach 230 warships converging on a Corvai holdout world defended, by every sensor reading his fleet possessed by fewer than 30 operational vessels and no meaningful planetary defenses. By any reasonable military calculation, the engagement would have been over within hours. I had my orders, Marshal. I intended to carry them out. What stopped you? A single transmission, Dask said, from a human vessel identifying itself as the Halworth's Promise, requesting nothing more than 3 minutes of my time before I committed my fleet to an irreversible engagement. I granted it out of curiosity more than courtesy, expecting some final, desperate plea for mercy on the rebels' behalf. What I received instead was a data package. He gestured, and the display shifted, filling with dense tactical and demographic analysis. A full accounting of the civilian population sheltering on that world, not soldiers, Marshal. 60,000 Corvi civilians, more than half of them children, crowded into settlements that our own planetary bombardment doctrine would not meaningfully distinguish from the 30 rebel vessels we had come to destroy. The human captain did not ask me to spare the rebellion. She asked me to look, honestly, at exactly what proportionate response would actually require. Before I executed an order written by people who had never seen this system except as coordinates on a directive. Vaun studied the demographic data in silence for a long moment, feeling the careful, professional distance she had maintained since reading the initial report begin to crack under the weight of numbers that had never once appeared in any council briefing about this campaign. Dask paused and something in his weathered expression shifted, as though he were choosing to revisit a memory he had not full. Lai allowed himself to sit with since it happened. I want you to understand what those 3 minutes actually looked like from my bridge, Marshal, because I do not think the report I filed afterward captured it properly. My fleet was fully committed. Weapons hot, formation locked, 30 seconds from the engagement window my tactical staff had calculated as optimal. Every instinct 30 years of service had built into me was telling me to close that channel and proceed. And on the other end of it was a single, unarmed voice, entirely calm, asking me only to look before I fired, not to stand down, not to abandon my orders, just to look, honestly, at what I was actually about to do. I have commanded fleets into engagements I knew would be costly. I have never in 30 years had an enemy. And she was not even that, Marshal. She was nothing to this dominion at all, no treaty obligation. No chain of command connecting her to a single ship under my authority asks so little of me and means so much by it. What did you say to her? Vaun asked. Nothing at first, Dask admitted. I muted the channel and sat in silence for the better part of a minute, staring at 60,000 civilians rendered as a single number on my tactical display, trying to decide whether 30 years of discipline meant I owed my orders more than I owed my own judgment. My weapons officer reported the engagement window closing. I remember him asking twice whether I intended to proceed. I did not answer him either, not until I had reopened the channel to a woman I had known for less than 4 minutes, and asked her plainly what she believed I should actually do. He met Vaughn's eyes, and something in his voice carried the particular vulnerability of a man describing the single moment his entire career would eventually be measured against. She told me she couldn't make that choice for me, Marshal. She said the only thing she could offer was the truth, and the time to consider it honestly, and that whatever I decided afterward would be mine alone to carry. I have turned that answer over in my mind every day since. I do not think, in 30 years of service, anyone has ever handed me so much responsibility while asking so little for themselves in return. That data could have been fabricated, she said, though she heard, even as she said it, how little conviction the words carried. I assumed the same, Dask said, which is why I did not simply take her word for it. I deployed reconnaissance drones myself, independent verification, standard procedure for any engagement of this scale. The data was accurate, Marshal, down to the settlement, down to the population count. 60,000 civilians and 30 rebel vessels that had, by that point, exhausted nearly every meaningful resource they possessed to keep fighting. I was 11 days from ending a rebellion that intelligence assessments had already told me was effectively over, and the only way to end it faster than simple attrition would have accomplished on its own was to accept a level of civilian casualty that no directive I had ever been issued explicitly authorized, and that I did not believe, when I finally sat with the numbers honestly, I could carry for the rest of my life. Vaun turned from the display to look at Dask directly. And the human captain, what did she actually do, Admiral, beyond handing you a data package? A single unarmed trade vessel does not stop 230 warships from executing a directive simply by making the numbers uncomfortable. I have read enough Dominion service records to know that discomfort has never once in the history of this fleet been sufficient cause to abandon an order. No, Dask agreed. It wasn't the discomfort that stopped me, it was what she offered instead of it. He gestured again, and the display shifted a final time, showing a proposal document formatted with a precision that suggested it had been prepared long before Fleet 10 ever arrived in the system. A negotiated resolution, Marshal. Full Corvide demobilization of remaining rebel forces, verified by independent inspection, in exchange for the restoration of the agricultural autonomy that started this entire rebellion in the first place, and formal Dominion acknowledgement that the resource requisitions during the border conflict exceeded what the Corvide Treaty obligations actually required. She did not ask me to let the rebellion win, Marshal. She asked me to let it end in a way that did not require 60,000 civilians to pay for a mistake the Dominion itself had made 3 years earlier. A negotiated resolution requires two parties willing to negotiate, Vaun said slowly. The Corvide rebels you describe had already lost 3 years of ground to escalating punitive raids. Why would they trust a Dominion admiral's word over the evidence of everything the Dominion had already done to them? They didn't at first, Dask admitted. Captain Calloway brokered that trust the same way she'd apparently spent the previous 18 months building it slowly, and at considerable personal risk. What I did not learn until several days into the standoff was that her vessel had been quietly relaying communications between Corvide leadership and moderate voices within their own resistance for most of the last year, precisely because she believed long before my fleet ever arrived that this rebellion was heading toward an ending nobody actually wanted. When we arrived, she did not simply appeal to me. She spent the first 6 hours of the standoff convincing Corvide Command that a Dominion admiral willing to listen even briefly was worth the risk of trusting again, after 3 years of every prior Dominion officer proving that trust was a mistake. I do not know what it cost her personally to make that argument credible to people who had every reason not to believe her. I know only that she made it and that it worked, and that I have not, in 30 years of service, seen anyone stake so much on the simple bet that most people, given an honest alternative to slaughter, will choose it. Vaun sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere she had not expected a briefing to reach. You understand, Admiral, that what you're describing is not a tactical decision. It's a fundamental deviation from a lawful council directive, executed unilaterally, based on the word of an unaffiliated foreign national with no standing in Dominion command structure whatsoever. I understand exactly what I did, Marshal, Dask said, and for the first time something steely entered his weary voice. I did not deviate from that directive because a human asked me to. I deviated from it because I looked honestly at 60,000 civilians and 30 exhausted rebel vessels, and I could not find anywhere in 30 years of service to this Dominion a version of myself willing to call that proportionate. Captain Calloway did not make that decision for me. She simply made certain I had all the information required to make it honestly, and then she did something I have found in 11 days of reflection that I respect more than almost anything I have witnessed in my career. She waited. She did not threaten my fleet. She did not attempt to manipulate me into a choice I wasn't prepared to make on my own judgment. She handed me the truth and trusted that a Dominion officer, given the chance, might still choose to be the kind of person his oath was actually written to produce. Vaun requested to meet Captain Calloway directly before she made any recommendation to carry home, and Dask arranged it without hesitation, as though he had been waiting 11 days for someone to finally ask the right question of the right person. The Halworth's promise was smaller up close than its steady, unhurried presence in the standoff had suggested. A modest survey and trade vessel, well-maintained but clearly built for endurance rather than any kind of confrontation. Utterly unremarkable except for the fact that it had, by every account Vaun had gathered so far, single-handedly prevented the largest atrocity in a century of Dominion military history. Captain Anise Calloway met her at the airlock personally. A lean, weathered woman somewhere in her middle years, dressed in the practical, undecorated coveralls of someone who had spent far more of her life doing hard, unglamorous work than standing in front of anyone important, and who regarded Vaun now with a calm, level attention that held neither fear nor triumph. only a kind of tired watchfulness. Marshal Vaun, she said, I imagine you have questions I haven't already answered for Admiral Dask, though I doubt there are many left. I have one that matters more than the rest, Vaughan said. You are not Corvi, you are not Dominion. By every treaty this Dominion currently observes, you had no standing to intervene in a matter of internal rebellion and no obligation whatsoever to risk your vessel, your crew, or your species' entire relationship with the Ashville Dominion on behalf of people who are not your own. I would like to understand why you did it anyway. Calloway considered the question for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried none of the practiced diplomatic caution Vaughan had expected from someone navigating this many layers of political risk. Because I spent 18 months getting to know the people on that world before your fleet ever arrived, Marshal, and I couldn't find a version of walking away that I'd have been able to live with afterward. My own species is barely 3 years into knowing civilizations like yours exist at all. We don't have your history, your treaties, your centuries of practiced diplomacy. What we do have is a fairly recent memory of what it feels like to be judged by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see us as anything other than a threat to be managed. I looked at the Corvi, and I recognized something in their situation I didn't think I had the right to simply watch happen to somebody else, especially not when I genuinely believed there was still a door open that nobody with the authority to open it had thought to check. And if Admiral Dask had refused your proposal, Vaughan said, if he had simply carried out his orders regardless of the numbers you presented him, what would you have done then? Kept trying, Calloway said simply. I didn't come here with a plan that only worked if everyone said yes on the first attempt, Marshal. I came here believing that most people, even people carrying orders they didn't write, want to be the kind of person their own conscience can live with if somebody's willing to make that choice visible to them instead of just handing them a directive and walking away. Admiral Dask made a hard decision. I didn't make it for him. I just made sure he had every piece of the truth before he made it, because I've found, in every version of this kind of moment I've been part of, that people rarely choose cruelty when they've actually been given the full weight of what it costs. They choose it when it's been made easy to look away from. Vaughan studied her for a long moment, feeling something shift in her own carefully guarded professional certainty, not doubt about the facts, which Dask's independent verification had already settled beyond argument, but something quieter and more unsettling, a recognition that the woman standing in front of her had accomplished, with nothing but patience and honesty, something that 230 warships and 3 years of escalating Dominion force had never once managed to achieve. I need to bring this back to my council, Vaughan said finally. And I want you to understand, Captain, that there is a very real possibility they will not receive it the way it deserves to be received. There are people in that chamber who would rather believe your species orchestrated some elaborate manipulation of a Dominion fleet than believe an admiral simply chose mercy when he was finally given the chance to see it clearly. I understand that risk better than you might expect, Marshal, Calloway said. But I'd rather bring an uncomfortable truth home and let the consequences fall where they land than let a lie about what actually happened here stand simply because it would be easier for everyone to believe. I think that's usually the better bet in the long run, even when it doesn't feel like it in the moment you're making it. Vaughan returned to Dominion Fleet Command with 3 hours to spare against Threll's 48-hour deadline, carrying Dask's full tactical reconstruction, the independently verified civilian demographic data, and a recorded statement from Captain Calloway that she suspected, correctly, would be the single most contested piece of evidence in the chamber she was about to enter. If you've been sitting with the same question Vaughan was sitting with on that transit home, whether a council built on 3 generations of overwhelming force would actually choose to believe an uncomfortable truth over a comfortable lie, that's exactly the tension this next scene is built around. So if you want to see how it lands, go ahead and hit like, subscribe for the next story, and tell me in the comments whether you think Threll's council votes for the truth or against it. Now back to Dominion Fleet Command, because Vaughan was about to find out herself. The council chamber was fuller than she had expected for an emergency session. word of Fleet 10's silence having clearly spread through Dominion political circles faster than any official channel had intended, and she felt the weight of every eye in the room as she took her position at the central podium, Threll watching her from his seat with an expression that gave away nothing of which way he had already decided to lean. Marshal Vaun, the presiding counselor said, an elderly Asheville whose measured neutrality Vaun had learned over years of testimony before this body not to mistake for indifference. You requested 48 hours to bring this chamber an answer regarding the silence of Fleet 10. You have returned in considerably less time. I trust that means you have won. I do, Vaun said, and laid out the full account without softening a single detail, Dask's independent verification. The 60,000 civilians, the negotiated resolution, Captain Calloway's role in brokering trust between a Dominion admiral and a rebellion that had spent 3 years learning not to believe a single Dominion promise. She watched the chamber's reaction as she spoke, the ripple of murmurs that rose and fell across different factions, and understood before she had even finished that this was not going to be a unanimous reception. Threll rose the moment she concluded, exactly as she had expected he would. Admiral Dask deviated from a lawful count. "Ill directive," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber with the particular certainty of a man who had spent 3 days preparing for a very different outcome and was not going to abandon his position simply because the facts had shifted beneath it. Whatever his reasoning, whatever numbers a foreign trade captain presented him, the fact remains that this Dominion issued an order to end a rebellion decisively, and Fleet 10 chose unilaterally not to carry it out. If this council allows that precedent to stand unchallenged, we are telling every officer in this fleet that personal judgment now supersedes lawful command whenever the numbers make them uncomfortable. That is not mercy, Marshal. That is the beginning of the end of discipline this Dominion has relied upon for 3 centuries. With respect, Counselor, Vaun said, holding his gaze across the width of the chamber, I would ask this body to consider what discipline was actually being asked to accomplish in this case. 60,000 civilians, more than half of them children, in exchange for ending a rebellion that Admiral Dask's own reconnaissance confirmed was already down to 30 exhausted vessels, and no meaningful capacity to continue resisting for more than a few additional months at most. I do not believe discipline requires an officer to abandon his own conscience when the order in front of him asks for a level of destruction that even the most conservative military doctrine this Dominion has ever codified would struggle to call proportionate. I believe, Counselor, that what Admiral Dask actually demonstrated was the exact judgment this Dominion claims to want from every officer we commission, the willingness to look honestly at a directive before executing it, rather than treating obedience as a virtue independent of what it actually costs. A long silence settled over the chamber, and into it an unexpected voice rose from the gallery reserved for lower-ranking officers permitted to observe but not formally participate in council proceedings, Fleet Admiral Dask himself, who had returned with Vaughn's cruiser rather than remain behind with his fleet, and who now stood, uninvited, waiting to see whether the chamber would grant him the courtesy of being heard. The chair recognizes Fleet Admiral Dask, the presiding counselor said, after a pause long enough to make clear the recognition was a deliberate choice rather than mere procedure, though he is reminded he speaks here at the council's discretion, not by right. I understand that, Counselor, and I am grateful for it, Dask said, and something in his weathered, steady voice carried a weight that silenced even the last murmurs of dissent still working through the chamber. I have served this Dominion for 30 years. I have executed orders I did not always agree with because I understood and still understand that discipline matters, that a fleet cannot function if every officer treats every directive as a matter for individual debate. I did not deviate from my orders lightly, honored counsel, and I did not deviate from them because a human captain asked me to. I deviated from them because I looked at 60,000 civilians and 30 exhausted rebel vessels, and I understood, with a clarity I have not felt in 3 decades of service, that the order in front of me was not asking me to end a rebellion. It was asking me to commit an atrocity and call it victory, because nobody in this chamber had been forced to look closely enough at the numbers to understand the difference. He paused and let his gaze sweep the assembled council, finding Threll's eyes and holding them without flinching. I would ask this body to consider, honestly, what kind of dominion we intend to remain. One that measures its strength by how completely it can destroy those who resist it, or one capable of recognizing, even at the last possible moment, that there was still a better ending available if only someone had been willing to look for it before the orders were carried out instead of after. The vote that followed was not unanimous. Threll and a hardline faction of perhaps a fifth of the chamber held to their position even after every piece of verified evidence had been laid before them. A fact Vaun would carry with her afterward as a quiet, sobering reminder that truth alone did not always change every mind it reached. But the majority carried decisively. Admiral Dask's decision was formally upheld rather than censured. The negotiated resolution with Corvi leadership was ratified as official Dominion policy, and in a provision that surprised Vaun more than any other outcome of the session, a formal commission was established to review the resource requisition policies that had triggered the rebellion in the first place. With explicit acknowledgement that the Dominion's own conduct bore responsibility for a crisis, it had spent 3 years blaming entirely on Corvi defiance. It was not. Vaun understood a complete victory. Threll's faction would not forget this session, and she suspected the political cost of today's outcome would follow both her and Dask for years to come, in ways neither of them could yet fully predict. But watching the formal ratification pass into Dominion record, she found herself thinking less about the political cost than about the simple, improbable fact that had made this outcome possible at all. A single unarmed trade vessel, crewed by a species barely 3 years removed from complete isolation, that had chosen to risk everything on the belief that most people, given an honest choice, would not choose slaughter when mercy was made visible to them instead. She found Captain Calloway one final time before the Halworth's promise departed the Dominion capital, standing at the same modest airlock where they had first met, and found herself, for once in a long career built on careful professional distance, without a fully rehearsed thing to say. The Council ratified Admiral Dask's decision, Vaun said instead. The rebellion ends without further bloodshed. The Corvi retain their autonomy, and this Dominion, for the first time in 3 years, has actually acknowledged that its own conduct contributed to the crisis. I don't know how to properly thank someone for accomplishing something my entire fleet with 230 warships could not. You don't need to thank me, Marshal, Calloway said. I'd rather you just remember it the next time a directive lands on your desk asking for more destruction than the situation actually requires. That's worth more to me than any thanks. My species is going to spend the next century figuring out exactly what kind of neighbor we intend to be in a galaxy this old and this complicated. I'd like it to start with people remembering that the strongest thing we ever did out here wasn't winning a fight. It was making sure one didn't have to happen at all. The story of Fleet 10 did not stay contained within the Dominion Council chamber for long. Word of what had actually happened in Sector 9 Delta spread through Asheville territory in the weeks that followed, carried first through official channels, and then, inevitably, through the far less controllable networks of rumor and personal correspondence that no council directive had ever managed to fully suppress. Vaun found in the months after the ratification vote that the story changed shape depending on who told it. In some tellings, Admiral Dask became a cautionary example of discipline abandoned. In others, a quiet hero who had reminded an ancient dominion what its own founding principles had once actually meant, before 3 centuries of expansion had worn the meaning down into something closer to habit than conviction. What struck her most across all the variations was how consistently the story returned to the same detail, regardless of who was doing the telling: a single unarmed human vessel, captained by a woman with no formal standing in Dominion affairs, who had simply refused to accept that slaughter was the only available ending, and had been patient and honest enough to prove it. She thought of that detail often in the months that followed, as her own career settled into an uneasy but genuine respect within the council chamber. Not universal, not without cost, Threll's faction never fully forgiving what they continued to characterize as a dangerous precedent, but real nonetheless, the particular respect earned by an officer willing to risk her own standing on the belief that the truth, however uncomfortable, was worth more than the easier version of events. She thought of it too, when the first formal Dominion trade delegation departed for Sol System 8 months later, carrying with it not the cautious, purely observational posture the Dominion typically extended to young, unproven conquered species, but something closer to genuine curiosity, an invitation to deeper cooperation extended to a species that had, apparently without any coordinated design or grand strategic intention, simply demonstrated exactly the kind of character an ancient civilization like the Asheville Dominion had begun to suspect might be rarer and more valuable than raw military strength. Ambassador Elena Reyes, receiving that same delegation on Earth's behalf months later, would remark in a private communication to Vaun, the two of them having struck up an unlikely and increasingly candid correspondence in the aftermath of the affair, that she found it darkly amusing how often her species' most consequential diplomatic victories seemed to arrive not through carefully planned strategy from Earth's own government, but through the quiet, unsanctioned choices of individual humans simply doing what seemed right to them in the moment, with no expectation of recognition and no awareness, half the time, that they were shaping anything larger than the immediate crisis in front of them. I sometimes think, Reyes wrote, that we keep stumbling into the galaxy's respect one honest decision at a time, made by people who never once set out to represent an entire species and would probably be uncomfortable to learn they had. I'm not sure that's a bad way to build a reputation in the end. It might even be the only way that actually holds. Vaun kept that message longer than she kept most correspondence, turning it over occasionally during the quiet hours of a career that had grown, in the years since Sector 9 Delta, considerably more complicated and considerably more meaningful than the rigid, disciplined path she had once assumed would define the whole of her service. She thought of Fleet Admiral Dask, who had retired quietly 2 years after the affair, choosing to spend his remaining years by his own account, simply glad to have discovered, in the last meaningful test of his career, exactly what kind of officer 30 years of service had actually made him. She thought of Captain Calloway, whose small, unremarkable trade vessel continued, as far as Vaughn's occasional inquiries could determine, its quiet work along the Corvi Reach and beyond, never seeking the recognition that history had nonetheless begun, slowly and irreversibly, to attach to her name. And she thought most often of the number that had started it, all 10 fleets sent to end a rebellion, and only 9 that had returned reporting the kind of victory the Dominion had expected. The 10th had returned reporting something else entirely, something the Asheville Dominion had not built any doctrine to properly measure, and Vaun had come to believe across the years that followed that this failure to fit the expected shape of victory was not a defeat at all. It was the first quiet evidence of something the galaxy's oldest civilizations were only beginning to understand about the newest one among them, that humanity's rarest weapon had never been strength held in reserve, but the stubborn, unglamorous willingness to look for a better ending, even when every directive in front of them insisted that one didn't exist. 10 fleets had been sent to end a rebellion. 9 had reported destruction. The 10th had reported something the history of the Asheville Dominion had never once recorded in 3 centuries of conquest. A rebellion ended not by the weight of its enemies' guns, but by the simple, radical decision to believe that mercy, offered honestly and at real personal risk, might still be strong enough to change the ending everyone else had already assumed was written. It was, Vaun thought, watching the quiet turn of the capital world below her office one final time before closing the file on an affair that had quietly reshaped the rest of her career. Exactly the kind of victory worth remembering, not because it was easy, but because it had proven, when it mattered most, that it was still possible.